What's poppin', family? Today we're going to be going over reductionism. So, a person who believes in reductionism is a person who believes that everything can be explained by reducing complex ideas or issues down to their simplest component parts. So, for instance, to reductionists, all other worldviews are going to be seen as sloppy and unscientific. So they're going to choose to ignore any evidence from observational studies. For instance, a person who is applying a reductionist view is going to try and break something down to the point to where they may not be receiving the full truth. And this is important to consider because when we understand about the universe and connections, in order to establish a connection, there first has to be some form of visual confirmation. You know, say for instance, if we have a lighter, and you've never seen a lighter before, there's no way for you to know how to use this lighter. Well, if you see me do this once, maybe twice, for sure the third time. By the third time, you should have some connection to say, wait a minute, when this moves, this occurs. And this is a basic simplification of the concept. And so understanding nothing about the actual fluid dynamics or the material properties of the lighter, understanding none of that, you are still able to get it to function. And if you figure out different use cases for this function, well then again, that can benefit one person or it can benefit millions. However, if you are unable to piece together how something works, and you've applied this reductionist view to where you've broken it down to the sum of its parts, its simplest parts, and it still no longer makes sense to you, at that point, what do you do? Do you continue to take in oppositional data that would only further make your standing slippery? Or would you find data that makes your standing more concrete, more stable, more secure? Typically, we find information that confirms what it is that we are thinking, the idea that we are chasing down, the concept, ideology. And when you understand, you've got reductionism on one end of the spectrum, and then you've got expansionism on the far end of the other spectrum. And this is like a swinging pendulum. So for the longest time, society has been in a reductionist type of operation where left brain attributes have been in high demand. You know, everything that is valuable present day is based upon left brain thinking. And left brain is going to be more analytical, rational, mathematical, factual, versus the right brain, which is going to be more holistic, more imagination, more synergistic, more subjective. And it's important to understand when it comes to certain things like medical treatments, for instance, we've had a medical industry that has been predominantly driven by which disease generates the most money. And when you create a system that is disease driven, well, it leaves out a lot of the individuals, and it doesn't leave room for an individualized treatment because there is only this default mass treatment, mass disease, because this is what's most common. However, when we look at medical treatments from a holistic standpoint, this is more about creating a synergy and understanding the relationships and the connections of things within that individual's life. For instance, if an individual is taking a certain medication and it is unknown how this medication is going to interact with another medication that is trying to be prescribed, the new medication, well, again, this can create complications. This can create all sorts of problems for the user, and it can easily be avoided by understanding that disease is an individualized issue. It is not something that should be looked at from a statistical standpoint and just kind of throwing things on the wall and hoping things stick, when it has been very clearly linked that things such as stress is more debilitating than a person's diet over a course of their life. You know, if a person is constantly exposed to high toxic levels of stress versus a person who's had a properly nutritious diet, obviously there's going to be a fundamental baseline difference in understanding. But from a performative standpoint, from a objective standpoint, does the soul who is practicing or has a perfect diet, does their life hold more value than the other? That isn't the case, and that wouldn't make sense for that to be the case if we are under the assumption that all souls are created equal, that in essence, there is some form of equality. We have to think for a second. Equality is a concept. And in order for something to be equal, it has to be measurable. And in order for something to be measurable, it has to be objective. We can't measure a subjective feeling, right? I can give you a scale, but it's never going to be a definitive, precise, actual measurement. And when you look at things from a societal standpoint, it makes sense why the pendulum had to set up in a prove-it, hardcore, hard mathematical fashion. But as it shifts, the subjective and the internal gnosis knowledge is beginning to fill in the gaps that science hasn't been able to for thousands of years. And this is how you're seeing certain individuals with access to knowledge that is seemingly occult or seemingly lost, or even something that is so nuanced, as brain surgery, is being reduced and understood by individuals who can soak up the vibrations of these professions, of these different outlets. And when you understand that every job before you has been created to channel a certain energy. A firefighter fights fires because the person who fights fires enjoys that energy. And because the people who created the world understood this, they created these different channels, these different modalities where you can express this energy via their means, via their laws, their regulations. But you have to understand that laws were broken in order to make laws. So how does that make sense? This creates a paradox because it essentially makes you ask, well, okay, if ethics is something we should be concerned with, something we should pride ourselves on, acting out in an ethical manner, how is it that we've allowed such a disconnect to be created from the constant onslaught of just sweeping things under the rug and never truly looking at the truth for what it is. Because there are many connections that can be made from any event. However, when people just assume and see things on the surface level, the surface meaning, this is how a lot of things are allowed to slip under the rug. And so when we look at terms for reductionism, we see things like parts, rationale, categories, future, past, static. I want to say it's important to highlight separate notes. Reductionism is about separate notes, whereas holism is about harmony. And so when you understand, okay, if I've got these 7 notes, I've got C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? I've got these 7 notes in this one octave. Well, when I press the C note, okay, that's a cool sound. But what happens when I press the C and the E? Oh, okay, there's a bit of harmony. What happens when I press the C, the E, and the G together? Well, now I've got a chord. And if you think about what a chord is a string. A chord is something that is able to be woven, right? And so if we have all these separate notes, all these people that are playing their own tunes, and we are now more concerned with harmony, instead of having this person just blasting this F note and this person just blasting this A note, let's see if we can get this person to play a C note, and let's see if we can get this person to play an E. Or let's figure out what is going to create that harmonious chord so that we are living in harmony versus everybody playing their separate notes. This is how society has been set up largely until this point, where everybody is playing their separate notes. And America is probably the best demonstration for this, because while America is great at being autonomous, and if you think about the word autonomous for a second, autonomy actually comes from the Latin root words auto and autos and nomos. And autos means self, and nomos means law. So autonomos means essentially having its own law, being able to govern oneself. That essentially is autonomy, right? And for the most part, America is great at this concept of executing on autonomy. However, you have to understand that this is a scale. And like we said, when you go one extreme, then it becomes a further journey to get from the full reductionist view to the holistic or the expansionism view. It becomes a long journey, versus if you're somewhere in between and you kind of apply some reductionism, but you also kind of apply some expansionism, it becomes easier of a distance to travel and understand these two modalities versus being on one end of the spectrum. If you're purely on a imagination side, right? Well, obviously, if there's no practicality to your models, and a model is just a story. So if there is no predictability to your story, well, then your model is not a very good model of reality, right? Because it is not accurately predicting reality. Your story has to accurately predict reality. So if you, for instance, say that unicorns exist, but the reality doesn't reflect that, well, then again, your model does not become a useful tool in predicting the reality. Therefore, it won't be adopted and inserted into the subconscious and the systems of the people that are using this idea, that are piggybacking off of this idea. And when you think about all these labels and terms, all of this is just a sloppy way to understand and try to attempt to describe energy. This is something that can't be described, yet we are trying to create different languages and words and symbols and things that get close to the feeling of. But again, it comes back to a subjective sense of how well do you know your inner truth? Because if you do not know your inner truth, and your inner truth is being provided via an institution or education system or anything that is already readily available that was here before you got here, well, again, you have to understand these things were not created with your best interest in mind. This was created at some point in time to further another man's ideology, another group's ideology. And when you understand the power of organization, organization is the most powerful tool in the universe, because when a organism organizes, when any type of cells begin to organize, very, very interesting things happen. And the same can be applied on the macro sense. When people begin to organize, very interesting things happen, because you're talking about a multitude of generating energy that is being focused like a laser beam towards a cause. And this has the ability to burn through, to illuminate, to do all of these different types of things that were not possible on an individualized basis. But it comes down to the focus ability, the ability to focus and organize. Not everybody has the ability to, one, lead, or two, organize a bunch of people. Now, once you have a bunch of people organized, well, keeping those people in a orderly and ruly fashion and also focused is another task in itself, because you're dealing with different energies, you're dealing with different elements. And when you understand, this is all alchemy. This is about understanding how to combine certain elements so that you get the results that you intend. If you're not getting the results that you intend, well, then again, that isn't a very effective means, and anybody who is trying to get results is not going to continuously do the things that don't work. But when you look at history as a whole and you see the things that are continuously being repeated, right? Same scenarios, just different actors. Well, you got to recognize the reason they're doing these continuous mass rituals, these continuous things like this, is because it's effective. It works. It's been working. And again, why are they going to change something if it's been working? What they're simply going to do is rebrand it. And you have to understand the power of the rebrand, because everything is the same as it's always been. Your job in this reality is to just figure out the things that have been rebranded and what they really are now. So when you understand, oh, this was actually this disease, but now it's called this. This shows the same symptoms and this is this. Oh, this is just this now. Okay. When you understand that the people who are pushing these energies, the people who are supporting these energies, again, this is the oldest play in the book. And when you realize this, when you see it, it becomes clear how and what they are operating out of, because when you understand a person's energy who is operating out of reductionism purely, this is just a person, again, who is on the path, the sliding scale. Because if you see the scale I've got on the PDF here, you'll see Satan, autonomy, mastery, and reductionism. And this starts off at reductionism, and then it moves up to mastery. So once you reach a level of mastery, right, you essentially, mastery is complete control. So if you feel that you have complete control over something, you feel that you have mastery over it. And there's a dangerous component of mastery, which comes with you believing that you know everything that there is to know about that subject. And so once you reach that point, you no longer are looking for outside sources of information. You're no longer taking in. At that point, you are saying you're proclaiming yourself as a master. Therefore, you're proclaiming you have complete control over the situation. Therefore, there's nothing for you to further manipulate. And then at that point, once you pass that level of mastery in that thought process, well, then again, the next step in the elevation is going to get into the mentality of Satan, which would be considered Lucifer. And if you break down loose and fur, loose means light and fur means to bring forth. So you're talking about the light bearer, and light is information. Information is light. So if somebody is bearing information, information is essentially what allows the devil to create schemes. Because without information, without understanding fully how something works, you can't create a system that is going to outsmart or trap the average man. You have to think a step above, hence why all these hence the term the devil is in the details. You know, when it comes to contracts, when it comes to legal contracts, legal terms, legal documents, all this language is very black and white, very heavy, dark, cold. And when you understand this energy, anybody who is not familiar or does not have that sense of inner light, that innate heat, it becomes very overwhelming. This environment is not for everybody. And when you understand this is a cold, created environment that is filled with landmines, tricks, loopholes, legalities, and all of this is, again, an attempt to create the ultimate trap, create the ultimate form of distraction so that people stay occupied with solving these non-existent problems that were created. And when you understand that there is a solution present for every problem in the world, however, too many people profit off of people's ignorance. And when you are profiting off of ignorance, it does not behoove you to educate, to inform, to allow people to have the resources they need. Because if they do, we don't have any more problems. If we don't have any problems, well, we don't have any wars. If we don't have any wars, well, then there's no us versus them. If there's no us versus them, nothing gets done. Nobody feels like doing anything because, again, why am I going to fight my family? Why am I going to fight my soul tribe? That doesn't make any sense. But if it's just me versus the world, well, now guess what? Well, now I'm going to go fight the world. And the world has that same mentality of, well, it's me versus the world. This is being programmed. So if this is what's being programmed, this main character syndrome where everybody becomes an extra and is just disposable, this is programming you to treat others like they don't exist, to treat others as if they hold no significance, no value. And you have to think about what this would do, not only to an individual being treated as an extra, but just a normal human being that is just trying to be seen, as most people are. And when you understand, or when you begin to think about the long-term effects, it's kind of scary to think that we are just at the beginning stages of this behavioral adaptation, this behavioral issue that we are beginning to just adapt and to take on as normal life. You know, this is becoming less and less jarring, and it's becoming more normalized by the day that people operate in such archaic, in such barbaric terms. But again, because people have the right to develop on their own pace, on their own timeline, there's only so much you can do for certain individuals. There's only so much you can do, and you have to hope that the people who are hearing are heeding the message and are not making the same mistakes you made, because that would be a complete waste of precious experience. And when it comes down to experience, if you and I are going to the same destination, but I leave 2 hours ahead of you and I tell you, yo, don't come down this road, there's traffic backed up for the next 8 hours. Well, obviously that is valuable information. And if you were able to take a detour and avoid 8 hours of traffic, that would be a huge win. And in life, this is the exact same way. We should be getting the information and the wisdom from our elders, from the experienced. However, again, there has been a fundamental disconnect from what is perceived to be valuable and what is actually valuable. What is actually valuable is the information that people contain within themselves, their life stories, because everybody's life story is a mystery. It is a mystery how some people survived. It is a mystery how some people make it out of certain circumstances. It is a mystery how people are able to be themselves in such an environment. However, when you look at things from a larger picture, a grand picture, it becomes, again, easier to see why so many means have been put in place to disrupt and to confuse and to isolate and divide people. Because if we're all sharing the stories, we'll all realize again that we've all been broken in different ways. But when you bring the pieces all together, they all fit. It's just a matter of finding out where the pieces fit. Maybe this piece doesn't fit right next to me, but it fits somewhere else, and it still has its place, and every single glass shard has its place. And I think that's important to highlight, is that people operate out of these different extremities, these different modalities, but at the core of it, there is, again, an individual, an observer that is trying to make sense of a nonsensical reality. And the more information, or the more bad information they receive, rather, that takes them away from self and disempowers them, the more they become accustomed to receiving their directions, the more they become used to receiving some form of guidance. And this is the purpose of religion. This is the purpose of institutions. This is the purpose of all these places that provide guidance. But what are they guiding you towards, right? What are you really truly being taught? What are you truly being projected upon? And what are you being made to internalize? Because if you ask yourself these things, it becomes a very interesting dialogue, because most of the things that we consume on a day-to-day basis is for our pleasure or for some form of value. Typically we don't watch or consume something unless we determine there to be some form of value. However, how are we determining this value? What if our value and incentive system is completely flawed and we value chaos, we value negative emotions, we value negative experiences? Well, then again, this is why I say the incentive system is so important to understand, because when you understand a person's incentives, especially a person that is coming from a reductionist standpoint, you understand, well, again, even if I provide all this information to this individual, they're not going to see it. They are incapable of seeing it, and that is just because of how their system is set up. Their system is not set up to take a CD. Their system doesn't have a CD drive, and you're trying to present a CD. So it's like, this is a useful form of data if they've only got a floppy disk drive, And I think that's the biggest concept I'm trying to convey when it comes to the reductionism, is understanding people have this way of thinking because perhaps they might not be able to think so abstractly. They might not be able to make the connections and see the relationships between things in space and time the same way that you have the ability to. But that does not mean that you are wrong or they are wrong. Again, there has to be this balance and this meeting in the middle where there's an understanding that both elements are needed, because again, if Satan is on one far end of the spectrum, then Christ would be on the opposite end. And Christ is, again, just the embodiment of recognizing every soul as an equal, treating everybody as the energy that is presented and not viewing people or souls rather through a skewed lens of reality with all these labels and perceptual filters that have been applied. I think it's something that we have to just be super wary of, especially when it comes to labels, because people are so quick to label themselves because they believe it puts them into some sense of a community. Even if it's a sickness, people will label themselves with this sickness so that they become part of that community. Well, now I'm part of a larger community that also shares this sickness and I don't feel alone. But in reality, again, that is the sickness, is thinking that you need to label yourself when there is absolutely no need. And anyone, again, that is trying to label you or apply these labels, you have to truly ask, where are they coming from energetically that they feel they have the right to apply a label to another individual, another energy, when they may not even fully understand their own label, their own energy. And so it becomes a very obvious hypocritical process. And I guess that's kind of life in a nutshell, is everything is very hypocritical and paradoxical. Because again, like I said earlier, in order to make laws, people had to break laws. So that kind of doesn't make sense to me. And I have a hard time processing that, because how can you enact and enforce something that you don't enforce upon yourself? So that, for the most part, has been Reductionism, family. Till the next time, peace.